It was never a European war. That was the first and greatest lie. The maps drawn in London, Berlin and Paris showed a conflict between empires, but empires are not continents. They are intricate, fragile webs, spun across oceans and deserts, connecting disparate worlds through force, trade and story. When the web trembled in Europe in 1914, the vibration travelled along every silken thread. It reached into the jungles of East Africa, the deserts of Mesopotamia, the snowy passes of the Caucasus, and the coral atolls of the Pacific. It pulled millions of people who knew nothing of the Schlieffen Plan, who had never heard of Sarajevo, into its fatal resonance. This was the first true world war, not because many nations fought, but because it systematically unraveled the world itself. It shattered the ancient empires that had organized human life for centuries. It activated the dormant forces of nationalism across the globe. It drafted the earth itself into the conflict, turning soil and soul into resources to be consumed. The Western Front was a monstrous, concentrated wound, but the rest of the planet was its nervous system, now on fire. The call went out from the imperial centers, and the colonial subjects answered, not out of passion for Serbia's fate, but out of complex webs of obligation, coercion, and sometimes a desperate hope for future recognition. From India, over 1 million men volunteered. Sikhs, Gurkhas, Punjabis, Muslims from the northwest frontier. They were shipped to the muddy hell of Flanders, where their turbans and dark skin marked them as alien in a white man's war. They fought with legendary bravery at Ypres and Neuve-Chapelle, freezing in clothes designed for the plains of Punjab, dying for a king-emperor whose face they had never seen. From French West Africa, the tirailleurs Senegalais were conscripted. They fought in the Dardanelles and on the Western Front, where German propaganda cruelly labelled them savages. They suffered disproportionately high casualties, often thrown into the most hopeless attacks. From Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, the White Dominions, men flocked to the imperial standard. For them, the war was a test, a rite of passage to prove their nationhood on the global stage. They would earn it in blood, and in that blood forge a new, more independent identity, separate from the mother country that had sent them to die. This global conscription created bizarre tablers. A Maori soldier from New Zealand might find himself in a trench next to a Flemish farmer, both staring across at a trench held by Algerian troops fighting for France. The war became a grim carnival of human diversity, all united in the common misery of industrialized slaughter. But the empire's reach extended beyond soldiers. It demanded bodies in every form, porters. In the African campaigns, hundreds of thousands of men, and often women and children, were forced into carrier corps. They hauled artillery, ammunition and supplies through disease-ridden jungles, dying not from bullets but from exhaustion, malnutrition and dysentery. The war in sub-Saharan Africa was less a military campaign than a logistical holocaust, where the chief killer was the continent itself, weaponized by imperial need. Laborers, the Chinese Labor Corps, over 140,000 men recruited from rural China. They were not soldiers, they were human machinery. They dug trenches, unloaded ships, buried the dead, and cleared battlefields behind the Western Front. They were segregated, worked to death, and treated as expendable coolies. Their story is one of the great silences of the war, the non-combatants who were essential to the combat, yet written out of its history. The war globalized suffering. It made human beings from every corner of the planet into interchangeable parts of the imperial war machine. And then the empires began to eat themselves from within. The first to convulse was the most archaic Tsarist Russia. The war was a poison for which Russia had no antidote. Its bureaucracy was corrupt, its industry underdeveloped, its transportation network feeble. By 1917, it was bleeding to death. Soldiers went to the front without rifles, told to pick them up from their fallen comrades. The home front collapsed into famine and chaos. In March 1917, February by the old Russian calendar, the dam broke. Bread riots in Petrograd spiraled into revolution. The Tsar abdicated. A weak provisional government took over, foolishly vowing to continue the war. Into this power vacuum stepped Vladimir Lenin, smuggled into Russia by the Germans in a sealed train like a human pathogen. His message was simple, brutal, and perfectly tailored to the moment: peace, land, bread, stop the war, give the peasants the land, feed the people. In November 1917, October, the Bolsheviks seized power. Their first act was to sue for peace. At Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, they signed a treaty with Germany of staggering humiliation, ceding a third of Russia's population and richest agricultural and industrial land. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years old, was executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The first communist state was born not from a utopian dream, but from the catastrophic failure of an empire to wage modern war. The war had not just defeated Russia, it had annihilated it, and from the rubble, a terrifying new ideology emerged, one that promised to overthrow the entire global order that had created the conflict. The next empire to fracture was the Ottoman. The sick man of Europe was dragged into the war by ambitious, nationalist young Turks who saw an alliance with Germany as a chance for revival. It was a fatal miscalculation. The war against the Ottomans became a crusade of colonial ambition disguised as liberation. The Gallipoli Campaign 1915 was a bold, catastrophic Allied attempt to force the Dardanelles, seize Constantinople, and knock the Ottomans out of the war. It pitted troops from Australia, New Zealand, Britain and France against a determined Turkish defence led by a then unknown colonel named Mustafa Kemal. The result was a smaller, sun-scorched version of the Western Front, a stagnant beachhead of hideous suffering. For the Australians and New Zealanders, Anzacs, Gallipoli became their national baptism of fire, a story of courage and futility that forever severed their emotional tie to Britain. For the Turks, it was the heroic defense that forged the core myth of their modern national identity. But the most enduring poison was sown in the Middle Eastern theatre. Here, the war was a three-dimensional chess game of cynicism. The British, to undermine the Ottoman Empire, stirred Arab nationalism. They made promises through T. Lawrence to Sharif Hussein of Mecca, "Support us, and you shall have an independent Arab kingdom." Simultaneously, in deepest secrecy, British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and Francois George Picot were drawing lines on a map. They partitioned the Ottoman carcass into spheres of influence, carving up the Arab world into arbitrary, colonial-style states: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, with no regard for ethnic, religious or tribal realities. And then, in 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, viewing with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. 3 promises, 1 land. The betrayal was ontological. The war didn't just redraw the map of the Middle East. It drew a map of future conflict, layering competing nationalisms and imperial ambitions onto a fragile region. The modern Middle East's torment was not born in ancient hatreds, but in the clandestine meeting rooms of wartime London and Paris. The centrifugal force of the war also reached the heart of Europe, Austria-Hungary. This bizarre, polyglot empire of a dozen nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ruthenians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, was held together only by the faded majesty of the aged Emperor Franz Joseph and the bureaucracy of Vienna. The war, which began over its treatment of Slavs, became a death sentence. As the war ground on, the empire's subject nationalities stopped believing in its future. Czech and Slovak legions deserted or surrendered en masse to the Russians. The home front splintered along ethnic lines. By 1918, the Habsburg Empire simply ceased to function, then ceased to exist. It dissolved like a sugar cube in the rain, leaving a chaotic patchwork of new, insecure nation-states: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and enlarged Romania in its wake. These states were born from Wilson's principle of self-determination, but they were themselves mini-empires containing disgruntled minorities, planting the seeds for the next century's conflicts. The war became a furnace for identity. For colonial subjects, the experience was profoundly dissonant. They were told they were fighting for freedom and civilization against German tyranny. Yet they faced racism from their own officers, were used as cannon fodder, and returned home to the same second-class status. The hypocrisy was glaring. The Indian soldier who had seen the fragility of the white man in the trenches, who had fought as his equal in hell, could not accept being treated as a subordinate in peace. The war planted the unkillable seed of the demand: if we are good enough to die for the empire, we are good enough to govern ourselves. The same was true for the Dominion, the blood sacrifice at Gallipoli, and the Somme bred not gratitude but a fierce, independent nationalism. Mother Britain had led them into a slaughter. They would henceforth chart their own course. The war also birthed new forms of political consciousness. In the collapsed empires of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, ethnic and religious identities hardened into political nation-states. Zionism gained concrete promise through the Balfour Declaration. Arab nationalism, betrayed but not defeated, was activated. Armenian identity was met with a horrific attempt at annihilation, the 1915 genocide, the first modern cleansing, born from the paranoid, total war mentality of the Young Turks. By 1918, the globe lay shattered. The four empires that had entered the war, the Russian, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, and the German soon to follow, were gone. In their place was a volatile new world, a communist superstate in the East, a clutch of fragile new nations in Central Europe, a Middle East carved up by colonial fiat, and a global South simmering with anti-colonial rage. The war had globalized not just conflict, but the very idea of the nation. It had shown that empires were mortal. It had put modern weapons in the hands of subjugated peoples and shown them the weakness of their masters. The European Civil War had, in effect, declared open season on European global dominance. It had unleashed the forces that would, over the next half-century, dismantle the very colonial system that had made the world war possible. The conflict that began to preserve empires ended by destroying them. The war that was fought to maintain a global order succeeded only in rendering the order impossible. The shell that exploded in Sarajevo in 1914 did not just kill an archduke. It sent a crack racing through the foundation of the world. By 1918, the entire structure had fallen. The people of the planet now stood, dazed amidst the rubble, trying to imagine what could possibly be built in its place. They were no longer subjects. They were citizens, or they were revolutionaries, or they were the dispossessed. But they were no longer who they had been in 1914. The world had been made and unmade. The war shattered old empires and awakened new national identities from India to Iraq, often through betrayal and broken promises. Today, what dormant forces, ethnic, ideological, or climatic, are our own systems of power inadvertently awakening or betraying? And what new, volatile identity are being forged in the hidden trenches of our globalized world, waiting for their 1918 moment to emerge?